I'm Greg Bowles, the owner of BuyingSterling.com. Today we're going to talk about silver hallmarks, where to look for them on various pieces, and also how to test silver with nitric acid. First we'll look at some pieces that look like they're sterling silver, but they aren't, and you can easily tell it from the markings. All these pieces are American, which means that the hallmarks are typically on the bottom. If you look at this piece, you'll see that it says, it's got a fancy picture and some numbers, something that some people might confuse for sterling. But you notice there's no mark of 925 or sterling on this piece. Turns out this in fact is a plated piece. Another thing that you'll notice about these plated pieces is they'll typically have a little bit different look to them once they're tarnished. They'll be a little darker than actual sterling looks like. Here's another non-sterling piece by a common sterling maker, Wallace. People see the name Wallace and they figure, well, that must be sterling. But again, there's a little picture, the name of the maker, and an item number, but no indication of sterling or 925. That's another plated piece. And here's the last silver plated piece. Again, you see the name of the maker and the number, but no indication that the item is sterling. And all these three are plated pieces. Now we'll look at some hallmarks on some actual sterling pieces. We'll start with a knife. Most knives will have an indication that they are sterling either on the blade or right near the blade, where the blade and the sterling part meet. In this case, you can see that this one says stainless blade, sterling handle. That's very common. Most flatware will either have the marking somewhere near the top here, or more typically somewhere down near the bowl of the piece. Beg your pardon. You can see that this one clearly says sterling right there. Typically the lettering is either impressed into the metal or it's raised. Either one is very hard to duplicate, especially with this kind of density of metal. There are some fake items floating around, but they're typically thin-skinned items that you can stamp sterling or 925 into, and people do that with jewelry and other items, which is one of the reasons we pay less for jewelry, because every single item has to be tested. Here's a fork with raised lettering. As you can see, it says sterling there right near the end of the piece. And here's a sterling butter knife. Sterling's impressed into it. Now we'll look at some larger sterling pieces. Most American pieces, like this little plate, which has seen better days, will have the mark on the base somewhere here. This one I had to really look for. It turns out it's right here by my thumb, if you can see it. Very light marking. It says sterling right there. Because that's such a light and irregular marking, not all the letters look like they have the same depth. We'll go ahead and test this piece in a few minutes. British items don't always have the hallmark on the bottom. Sometimes the hallmark will be somewhere along here or somewhere on the body. In this case, this item only has the hallmark in one place, inside the lid. The British hallmark, unless it's a very old item, is always a lion. You should be able to see the lion there on the right. There he is. So because this didn't have a mark on the bottom, I went ahead and tested this the other day, and sure enough, the entire thing is sterling. So you're looking either typically for a 925, a mark that says sterling, or the British lion. On the website you can see a link to a site that looks at other worldwide hallmarks, so you can get an idea if you have foreign pieces whether or not they're sterling. In very rare instances you'll find a mark like this on an item. You can see that just says silver. We'll test this as well to make sure that this is actually silver and get some idea of what the silver content is, since there's no purity mark of 925 or otherwise. Most of the pieces you'll find are pieces like this, flatware, standard American items or British items that have very clear hallmarks that you don't need to worry about. Now we'll go ahead and test some silver items. There's only a few things you need to test properly. This is a bottle of 30% nitric acid solution. You can buy these on eBay for anywhere from $1.50 to $2 a bottle. And if you test a lot of silver like I do, a bottle like this will actually last you a month or more, so this stuff is incredibly cheap. You only use a drop of it at a time. You also need some kind of a clipping tool that has a cutting blade where you can snip little pieces off, and some kind of a firm razor that you can use to scrape small pieces off. Finally, you'll need a plastic sheet that has a light color so you can see the contrast when you do the testing. I recommend doing this in a well-ventilated area. The reason being, this stuff is noxious. The fumes are terrible. You don't want to breathe them in. You also want to wear gloves when you test this. I've gotten this acid on my hands before, and it'll leave your skin dark for several weeks. The Lord only knows what it does to your system if it's absorbed into your system. So please be careful when you use it. First item we'll test is what we know to be sterling, this beautiful little fork here. I'm just going to snip one of the tines off. That's the easiest way to test something. This is going to go to the refinery anyway, so it doesn't really matter what it looks like. I'm just going to snip the end of that off. You probably could hear when I snipped that it had very little sound. The sterling silver is actually almost like butter when you cut through it with a blade. It cuts very cleanly. Something like this requires 1 drop of nitric acid. You should put an extra drop. You should be able to see the reaction fairly quickly. You can see how powerful the acid is. You're getting an immediate red reaction, which is exactly what you want. Yeah, I can smell that already. So that's definitely sterling. Now let's look at an item that I know not to be sterling. I do this in part to show you some of the fallacies of sterling silver testing. A lot of people will tell you that their item has been tested for sterling when all they've done is put a drop of silver testing solution on the item somewhere. And watch what happens when we do that. And you can see that there is a red reaction to this, but then it goes to another color. So you don't want to be fooled, ugly blue. You don't want to be fooled by the initial red reaction and assume that something like this is sterling. Also put a drop on this bowl here. Show you what that looks like. Obviously this stuff is going to damage the material as well. Well, we didn't get any red from that. Sometimes you'll have an item where it's fairly heavily coated with silver plating, so even if you dip the item in the solution 2 or 3 times, you'll still get a red reaction. It's best to either cut or scrape an actual small piece off of the item. I'll show you what I mean by scraping with this butter knife. Let's say you get this from someone and you want to test it without damaging it. It actually takes an incredibly small amount of silver to show whether the test is true. You see we have this tiny little piece right there. That little piece is more than enough to tell us whether we have a proper reaction or not. You can see the red coloring. One thing to watch for when you test items you're fairly certain are sterling, if the acid goes to a more purplish color, you might be inclined to think that it didn't test properly. But what's actually happening in that case is the acid is simply overwhelming, or rather the silver is overwhelming the small amount of acid you have there. So if you have a piece of silver or sterling in a drop of acid and it starts to get kind of a purplish hue to it, add another drop of acid, and the acid drop should both go straight to red as the acid catches up to the silver content. Now we'll test those mystery items that we looked at earlier. This is that tray that simply marks silver. I already own this, so I'm going to go ahead and I've actually tested it before. I'm going to go ahead and just snip a small piece off the side here. See that piece right there?
Yeah, this is on it. You can see the red there. That's a fairly strong reaction. My guess is that this is probably coin silver or something like that, about 90% pure rather than 92.5%. You can also see here that you see the purple on the edge there. Most of the red's now gone from that drop, which means the silver's starting to overwhelm it. But watch what happens when I add another drop of acid. You can see that the red is more distinctive now. In some cases, if it goes completely purple and you add that extra drop, it'll just go straight to red for the whole thing. So we at least know that this bowl has decent silver content. We do buy non-sterling items. You can refer to our website for that. We pay a little bit less for them because it's often difficult to tell what the silver content is, but we do buy them. Now here's that little funky plate that had the kind of a weak impression of sterling in it, so I'm going to go ahead and snip a piece of this off as well. Get a little piece sticking out, and we'll just cut it right off. Oh, it didn't come off, beg your pardon. It's a nice big piece. See the purple there instead of red? That's a big piece of silver, so let's see what happens when we add more acid. Now if this was some other metal, you'd see a noxious bubbling green color, so this is definitely sterling. Let's take a look at what a small piece of definitely not sterling looks like. This fork's kind of interesting item because it does have some pretty fancy hallmarks. Before I tested it, I looked those up to see if they were any country-specific marks. Turns out that they're not. Sure enough, when I cut a small piece of this off, remember what the tine of the fork sounded like when I cut it? There was almost no sound at all. With that, that's a much more of a clinking metal sound. This will probably go ugly straight green right away. If that blue-green, that's a sure sign that we're not dealing with silver. Again, do it in a well-ventilated area and make sure you wear gloves so you don't damage your skin. This is an item that you want to incorporate into your testing repertoire, especially if you deal with a lot of jewelry. This is a rare earth magnet. It's incredibly powerful. Here's a sterling handled knife. You can see that the magnet immediately attracts to the steel blade. There's no attraction. There's no attraction to the sterling end of it. Sterling silver won't be picked up by a strong magnet. This is especially useful when you're doing jewelry. You can put a pile of jewelry down, wave the magnet over the pile, and any non-silver pieces will be attracted to the magnet. When you do that, oftentimes sterling jewelry will have clasps that are some other metal, and those will be attracted to the magnet. So you want to make sure it's the body of the item that's reacting rather than the clasp. One other thing I should mention is some sterling items will, or rather some jewelry will have a very weak reaction to the magnet. It'll barely lift them up. That's still a sign that it's not sterling. If the body of the item is sterling, the magnet won't react to it at all. That's really all there is to testing sterling. It's not complicated, but you don't even need to do this if you're sending us clearly hallmarked items, marked 925, sterling, or with the British hallmark. Almost everything we get in has those hallmarks. These testing procedures are more for people that are out hunting for metal and also likely to come across jewelry.
There are a lot of fake jewelry pieces that are stamped 925 or sterling, so they should all be tested. With foreign hallmarks, we're happy to get those items in and pay you accordingly. However, it's best to test them on your end if you can. We don't like to send items back unless we have to. When we do receive a shipment from you, the shipment is opened, processed, and if necessary tested on film to make sure that your items are being treated fairly. We retain the film until you've received our payment. Thanks again for visiting buyingsterling.com. We hope you consider using us when you have sterling to sell.